we've got an outstanding person to step in to be the moderator of this panel. You heard him earlier this morning and as he was helping to set the stage for our discussion. It's Greg Collins. And just to reintroduce him once again, Greg is the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the USAID Bureau for Food Security. He oversees strategic direction and implementation of Feed the Future programs in the field and the innovative agriculture research and policy efforts. And he is the USAID Center for Resilience and serves as the agency's resilience coordinator. Again, our panel will be discussing programming implications, adaptation, and innovation. So with that, I'll turn it to Greg Collins.
Thank you, Dr. Keenum and the BIFAD again. You really do pick them. This has been a very invigorating discussion so far. I was absolutely thrilled sitting in my chair. I've got all sorts of notes scribbled. I learned a lot of fresh new insights, and I think that's the power of these kind of meetings is bringing together disparate groups to have critical conversations. So thank you guys for doing that. And just maybe before we get into this panel, reflecting a bit on how to connect the last panel to this one, Emmy really set the stage by laying out the changing nature of conflict, followed by Cullen, who reminded us critically, I think, of the fact that sometimes dealing with one conflict has downstream effects that we really need to be thinking about how all these things are connected. And I think that's something this group is going to really have to sort of grapple with, because we're going to be talking about how we get away from a discussion of how complex, or as Soji said, wicked this problem is, to how you actually begin to implement programs on the ground to address this complex program, with some of the commentators speaking directly to how do you implement agriculture, yes, ag-led growth programming in some of these complex crisis areas, and really begin to take a development approach. I was also really struck by Leanne's contribution, talking about the social contract. If there's one thing we've learned about resilience in somewhat more stable areas in responding to recurrent crisis, it's these transcendent sources of resilience seem to matter most: social capital, women's empowerment, agency, aspiration, and add to that social contract, social cohesion is fundamental in looking at food security, agricultural-led growth, and resilience in these contexts of protracted conflict. And of course, Soji's great contribution, first in pointing out the wicked nature of these conflicts and the complexity they present, but also some of the data gaps, some of the research gaps. But this group of implementers can't afford, and USAID, in fact, all of us, can't afford to sit around. I like the idea of a SWAT team. It's a good one, because we can't afford to wait around for extensive 5 to 7 year research programs so that in phase 3.0 of Feed the Future that we begin to address this. We've got to be doing this on the fly because it's changing on the fly. So I think with that, just to sort of set the stage before I provide a brief introduction to our wonderful panel, and these are drawing on some themes that Jesse Anderson, who again regrets not being here, wanted to set the stage with. And some of it's already been discussed, so I'll just sort of high-level frame it. One, conflict sensitivity. And again, what Cullen said, we've got to take an expansive view around conflict sensitivity in terms of downstream effects. So our solution to a particular local, I forget the example, it was how northern Uganda affected fishing in Lake Victoria. That, I don't think we're actually thinking as extensively as we need to, even when we claim to be doing conflict sensitivity and do no harm. We're bounding it too much in a sense of local place when we really need to understand its effects over space and time. So I think that was a wonderful contribution. The other key thing that Jesse wanted to lay out was design with conflict in mind. Interventions need to be tailored to the context and to the unique features of each conflict. Emmy set the stage in noting that from the beginning and looking at a comparative historical view. But again, Leanne, you also helped us really focus on there is no single causal effect. Each place, there's multiple contingent causation happening here, and each place is going to be distinct in how those conditions combine to produce outcomes. So it's not as simple as if we make people food secure, there will be no conflict, but we know in certain places that agriculture and food security are critical components, both on the prevention side and on the recovery, speeding recovery side. And then finally, and this is where we get really operational, which, you know, I'm getting pretty good at giving these presentations, but it's really these folks who deal with how you take the glossy PowerPoint and then implement it on the ground, which is the sort of really, really difficult work of implementing these types of programs. And I think it forces us to think about new operational plans and strategies for dealing with unpredictable, fast-changing environments. We've done some work at USAID with this in developing guidance on what we call shock responsive programming, how to design programs that are able to adjust in the face of shocks and stresses. Again, that was primarily designed in the face of sort of drought events and floods. So how do we adjust that to deal with conflict? And it can't simply be this baton handing back to the humanitarian side. We've got to actually, if we're going to go into these places where we have protracted conflict, and we're going to make long-term development investments, not only in conflict mitigation and management, but in natural resource management, in agriculture and agricultural-led growth, in global health, et cetera, we've got to make sure those development interventions are actually flexible and adaptive to be part of the solution when a conflict emerges. So with that, let me introduce our wonderful panel. There is on your seats full bios for each of them, so I'll spare you the full reading of each bio, and you can read at your leisure. But let me start with Susanna Campbell, who's an assistant professor at the School of International Service, American University, and she'll be speaking about conflict sensitivity, which I think is critically important, as I've mentioned. Then we have Cedrine Chantal, who is the Senior Director for Agricultural Systems, Markets, and Financial Inclusion at Mercy Corps. Cedrine will be speaking about flexibility in program. As I mentioned, a critical operational component of this is we can't simply say it wasn't in the original project design, therefore we can't do it. We've got to have the flexibility built in. Then we have Louise Sperling, who's a consultant at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. Louise will speak about seed security programming, which is a very specific topic within this broader set of interventions required to not only make progress in areas of conflict, but actually prevent backsliding. I think one thing I would add to the conversation is we even need to re-envision what progress is in these areas. Sometimes progress isn't the classic moving well-being indicators, improving well-being indicators. Sometimes it's preventing them from backsliding. And then finally, Mohammed Abdi Noor, who's the Chief of Party of the USAID Growth, Enterprise, Employment, and Livelihoods Program, GALE, in Somalia, works with RTI International. And a rather large footnote, Mohammed and I actually worked together in 2011, 2012, and he helped give rise to USAID's resilience work in the Horn of Africa. So welcome, panelists, and let me start with Susanna.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Greg, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. So what I'm going to present today is kind of a basic description of conflict sensitivity and its implications. And this is based on about 20 years of work that I've done in this field, looking at the effectiveness of international institutions, whether it's bilateral donors, multilateral organizations, or NGOs, in war zones, essentially. So Sudan, South Sudan, Nepal, Congo, Burundi, Timor-Leste. I've done field work in all of these places, evaluating the conditions under which these large bureaucracies can actually deliver highly complex, innovative, adaptive programming. So this is really what I'm going to talk about is the supply side, right? A lot of the conversation up until this point has been about the demand, about the need for actually thinking about food security in conflict-affected countries and how we can actually respond to that demand. Well, how do you do this well? So who's heard of the term conflict sensitivity? Just a quick show of hands. Okay, who feels like they actually know what it is? Shaky, right? So I was one of the authors of the definition back in, I think, 2002. And the basic conceptualization is that it means you understand the conflict dynamics, you understand the relationship between your intervention in those dynamics, and you act on that understanding to mitigate harm and to increase resilience, increase development, whatever your kind of longer-term ambition is. And what's fascinating is that built into this definition is this core adaptive accountability framework, where in order to do that, you have to get regular information, you have to adapt quickly, and you have to solve very wicked problems within an hour, right? So part of the organizational challenge is how you deal with that. So I'm going to kind of walk through this one bit at a time and then set the stage for the examples and kind of more detailed level investigation that my fellow panelists will give. So conflict sensitivity matters because any input into a conflict environment feeds into the existing political dynamics, into the existing power struggles and power structure. So you will reinforce the conflict unless you try to do the opposite, right? That's big. And agricultural inputs, food security is no exception here. In fact, in many ways, the conflict sensitivity field and industry cut its teeth on food security and agricultural inputs based in places like South Sudan and in Congo, in some of the most protracted crises where you had repeated distribution of these agricultural inputs. So the first component of conflict sensitivity is understanding the dynamics, right? And what are conflict dynamics? One, it's about the history, it's about who the actors are, it's about what their interests are, it's about how they work with populations, it's about where they are operating. And this is not just a snapshot, one-time conflict analysis. This is an ongoing process of understanding what's happening, what's the political nature of this context in which I'm operating, period. And the very tricky thing here is that these conflict actors are no way disconnected from food security, right? They are the recipients of agricultural inputs. They play key roles in the food security value chain in all of its dimensions. They have the potential to strengthen or undermine market demand by changing the security environment. And furthermore, because food security and because agricultural inputs are lootable goods, they can also be a key target for any non-state armed group who's actually trying to get new resources both to feed their troops, right, and to actually manipulate and control power over access of these goods to the population. So it's a tricky environment, and conflict sensitivity first involves understanding that environment. Then, even more difficult is analyzing some kind of causal relationship, right, between your intervention and that environment. How are you affecting that environment? And how are you analyzing and understanding that in real time, which is extremely difficult? How might my agricultural inputs feed into existing conflict dynamics and be captured by one group or another? So there's an example in South Central Somalia where Al-Shabaab has been actually taking and using agricultural inputs both to feed their troops, right, and to actually manipulate which populations get access and which populations don't. This also happens to be one of the most famine-stricken areas in Somalia. So what do? Do you go in and just give lots of food aid? Do you go in and just give lots of agricultural inputs? How do you ensure that it doesn't feed into that conflict? And at the same time, you have a lot of people who may actually suffer from famine, malnourishment, extreme food insecurity if you don't help them. That is not a problem that is easy to solve. And I think that doesn't mean that it's not extremely important to do, but it's important to do it with your eyes wide open. How does the location of agricultural inputs and engagement with communities and government officials reinforce discriminatory property rights practices? Right, property rights, who has access to which kind of land, who can use these agricultural inputs is part and parcel of the conflict dynamics, both of what caused it and of the effect of displacement. So in Burundi, where I spent many years, there's an enormous amount of debate over who can actually access land, which returnees who are returning to the country can actually have which plots of land. There's not enough space to go around. Who you decide to work with, who you decide to give agricultural inputs to, determines who actually has access and who can ensure their own livelihood. These are highly political decisions. And the whole point of conflict sensitivity is there is no way of getting out of these. You can ignore them, but that doesn't mean that they go away. How do the formal market systems that you're trying to facilitate reinforce or undermine informal markets that actually might have benefited the most marginalized groups, right? So if we look at informal markets, who actually benefits from those? When formal markets come in, they can overtake, and then the power structure that you reinforce through the formal markets can actually undermine the most vulnerable people that you're trying to help. Which value chains are most perversely affected by ongoing conflict? And I have an interesting example from northern Mali, which in relation to the conflict there, the fisheries value chain was not affected because the rebels didn't like fish and they were afraid of water. Right? The livestock value chain was heavily affected. One, because when people were displaced, they were displaced to areas where they couldn't actually raise their livestock. Two, livestock are easy to loot, right? So the non-state armed groups could actually take the livestock, right? And one, feed their troops, but also sell it on the market, making money for themselves. So it's important to see all of these different inputs as going into this highly contested conflict economy. Finally, to think about who are your staff operating in each location. Are they, in the research that I did in Burundi, are they primarily Tutsi representing the government status quo, and therefore when they talk to and try to build trust with the Hutu communities, they just see them as kind of reinforcing the Tutsi power structure, right? Or they go in and they give favors just to their friends. So your staff, who they are, what they're doing, how they are viewed by the community is about being conflict sensitive. That matters for how you reinforce or undermine these conflict dynamics. So what do you do? I mean, this is extremely difficult. How do you actually figure out what to do in these contexts? The solution that I have seen and that I found in my research is you actually decentralize and become incredibly politically engaged. And what this means is that in a conflict-affected country, things change fast, right? So you have to begin to adopt this kind of business model that is very famous in kind of Silicon Valley, which is fail fast, right? You want to realize that you're not going to get it right. Even the most detailed, complex analysis is going to be outdated quickly. And so you need to adapt and learn quickly and ensure that you have three things. That you collect regular information about the relationship between the evolving conflict dynamics and your programming. Two, that you create some kind of downward accountability, what I call informal local accountability. That you find key stakeholders in the communities that you're working with. You create trust and you empower them to actually hold you accountable for being responsive to these complex dynamics. And thirdly, that you stop focusing on delivery and that you focus primarily on responsiveness. That you have to get out of this idea that the solution is to give goods, the solution is to respond to the needs in that context as they are changing. And so this is through short, quick feedback loops, which is very different from particularly a lot of the development programming timeframes and even many of the humanitarian timeframes. So the solution is not to spend money, right? The solution is not to deliver inputs. The solution is actually to respond to the changing needs and empower local stakeholders who themselves can build resilient communities and infrastructures to actually increase food security in these contexts. I'll stop there.
Great. That was a wonderful introduction to set the frame, and I think you hit the nail on the head. This is not about doing humanitarian programming better. We can leverage humanitarian footprints, but we've got to actually figure out how to take the tools of development, including agriculture and ag-led growth approaches, including market approaches to these areas. Again, we got to draw a line somewhere. There are some places that are so embroiled in conflict that we're not going to be able to do this, but we've got to take on those places where we can do it. And we're going to hear some of those about some of those from the other panelists. So I also appreciate you staying on time. I warned everybody I'm going to tap their elbow, physically grab them if they go over time. So with that, Sadrine, please join us at the podium.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Susanna, for setting the frame. I've just back from 15 years in the field, and I'll try to share with you some of the learning that I and others at Mercy Corps have collected in different contexts. First, $16 billion. That's the cost of the damages and the losses in the agriculture system in Syria in 5 years, from 2011 to 2015. Yet, 6.7 million Syrians still, after 5 years, relied on agriculture as a safety net for their food and for their revenues. And so this demonstrates that agriculture systems play a major role in building the resilience of population affected by conflict. And so what we need to do when we support this agriculture system is really on 3 fronts. One, we need to prevent the complete destabilization of these food systems. Second, we need to rebuild them fast so that livelihood can resume. And third, we need to rebuild them better so that they're more inclusive and they don't fuel further conflict. So the question is really, how do we do that effectively? And so to help us navigate through the different programming options that we have in this case, I just wanted to talk through the Mercy Corps Resilience Framework that some of you already have seen. And that's ask 5 very simple questions. One is resilience to what? So here we're clearly talking about conflict situation. Resilience of what, for whom, through what, and to what end? And I will take examples from Uganda, the DRC, and Northeast Nigeria, which are, as you know, in context of protracted crisis, so that are characterized by high level of violence that leads to displaced population and in a long period of time. So to the question, what have we learned throughout these 3 contexts? So to the question of what, resilience of what, which market should we actually select? And I will give you an example from the DRC where we did our homework. We selected the cabbage market because it was important in the local diet, and it really presented some clear economic opportunities for the population that we were serving, especially women. What we didn't factor in is that cabbage are actually the preferred crops for the militia. It's easy to cook, it's easy to harvest, and so each time they were passing through, they were stealing the harvest from the people that we were trying to serve. So not only didn't we accomplish anything to improve the well-being of the population that we were serving, but on top of that, we were putting them at risk. So we quickly shifted to the bean markets. Same nutritional outcomes, same economic opportunities, but much more difficult to harvest, much more difficult to cook, and so less likely to be stolen by the militia groups. So the selection of markets is critical if we want to increase the resilience of the population we're serving. To the question, resilience for whom? Well, we've seen, and some of our speakers this morning have talked a lot about who are the most vulnerable in situation of conflict, and how are they affected. Displaced population, women, and youth, I think we all agree, are the 3 main segments of the population that are the most affected. And so how do we respond to their particular needs? In terms of displaced population, the importance is really to kind of try to leverage the skills that they bring so that they contribute to the local economy, and or build skills that then they can use when they go back home. And so in Uganda, for example, we've worked with the local communities to put together some sharecropping agreements so that the refugees can actually produce and be part of the local economy and contribute to this local economy. To the question, through what? The idea here is really to look at the what, the when, and the how. And for that, in the situation that I've described in protracted crisis, you have peaks of violence, followed by relatively period of relative stability, and again, followed by peaks of violence. And with violence comes limited movement. And so we are taking the freedom of movement as a proxy indicator to kind of tell us, okay, what type of intervention can we actually put in place? So the more violence, the less freedom of movement, and the more we need to focus at the household level to really maintain their food security by, for example, building local solutions. We've seen in Northeast Nigeria that farmers do not have access to some of the chemical fertilizers that they used to because of some restriction. And so that's an opportunity also to really promote with them the use of biofertilizers so that they can produce themselves and have access to, so that they don't miss an agriculture season. And similarly, when there's when the freedom of movement is restricted, making sure that people don't lose their harvest and having local solution in terms of storage and processing. When there's less violence, then that's when the movement, the freedom of movement can resume. And this is when we can have a much more systemic impact on the food system. And so we can start looking at, for example, building social cohesion. In Uganda, we've strengthened the local structure, the farmer groups, by creating farmer groups that are mixed, including both refugees and local population, so that together with an economic incentive in mind, they can start forming and strengthening social cohesion. We can also start addressing some of the drivers of conflict. Land access, for example, and water access in the DRC. We're working with the local government and the local communities so that people can have to formalize some of the land titling and sharecropping agreement across ethnic lines, so that we can really have a more systemic impact when at this level. So what all of this mean and what does that require? And I think Susanna really put it right. I think lots of flexibility and agility in our programming, not from year to year, but really from months to months or weeks to weeks, because the situation are extremely volatile and change from one moment to the next. And how do we adapt our programming? This means that assessment, we need more assessment and reassessment, not only at the beginning of a project, but really throughout the implementation period to make sure that we understand what's going on. Which means also longer time frame. The responses, and again, I'm talking really in this protracted crisis that are longer in duration, but we need longer time frame for interventions. It's only after a 6-month assessment in Northeast Nigeria that we really understood all the market forces that were at play and the drivers of conflict, and that we felt confident that we were actually able to design some intervention for that context. The fourth one is include a broad range of actors. Traders are incredibly resilient. They have their sources of information. They can shift from one road to the next. And so really building on these local actors is key if we want to have an impact. And finally, that also means addressing some of the operational barriers, making sure that our systems, the procurement systems in place, the budgets, and the measurements can respond to this need for agility. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Again, right on 10 minutes. It's like I'm a miracle facilitator here. That was wonderful. I particularly like the diagram that was up here and this idea of being fit for purpose. It's not as though we can take The agricultural development program, we're plopping into Kisumu in Western Kenya and drop it into South Sudan and expect results. You've got to tailor to context, and tailoring to context means changing it over time as the context change. So thank you for that wonderful intervention. Okay, Louise, let's move on with you.
Pleasure to be here. Before I start, I'm curious, we are curious, how many people in the room have actually intervened on the ground in a conflict situation? Wow, great. How many people in the room have intervened in agriculture in a conflict? Lots of experience to share. Excellent. So this talk is going to be quite practical. I'm going to focus on a single sector. Has it come yet? Oh, good. A single sector, seed. And particularly I'm going to talk about seed security, and conflict. Now, seed is a big issue, not a small issue. It's the entry point in agriculture after disaster. It's the first entry point normally. These figures are kindly shared by FAO. Gives you an idea of the scale. What you see in a 6-year period, 97 to 2003, FAO's budget increased 7-fold. 2011 special relief funds, FAO alone, $750 million. The latest figures, 2016, FAO alone, 76 countries. So seed and the vulnerable are linked. For those of you who, there you go, no seed. Seed is big money. It's about $32 billion a year. Seed also, if used well, can be an incredible source of innovation, getting in climate-smart varieties, getting in nutritious varieties, even in conflict. And Pamela was talking about that alone. So link, seed, vulnerable, big money, innovation. All sounds good, except then you look at practice, particularly in conflict zones. We're doing the same seed responses again and again. Burundi, 42 seasons in a row. South Sudan, 20 plus years. Ethiopia, 42 years, some of it conflict, some of it not. So it's time for us to say, are we doing programming in conflict as we should be doing? Can we do it better? Okay, where do smallholders source their seed? And I'm talking about smallholders, vulnerable people, even IDPs. We have the largest data set in the world. This is USAID funded, very ground-based. What you see globally, it's about 16,000 observations. In Africa, it's about 11,000, many of them conflict areas. And I've highlighted in yellow particularly the conflict areas, and in Africa, this is not all the data sets. Okay, so vulnerable farmers, conflict farmers, where do they get their seed? Well, there are many possible sources. Each of the wedges is a different source. Surprisingly, look at the mustard. About a third comes from own stock. Another third comes from a local market. So 2/3 come from local channels. Look at the green. Maybe I can point here if this helps you. Here, the green here, this is formal sector, seed companies, agro-dealers. This is where Gates and most of USAID put all their money, most of their money. 3% of crops come from this sector. Similarly, this is community-based. So all the NGOs who do community-based work, and I'm very critical of all of us together, right? How can we do this better? Less than 1% of the seed sown. So one issue is, where do we invest in a disaster? How do we leverage all channels? How do we do it better? Okay, I'm going to continue on this theme of markets. For those of you who have never seen a seed market, on the left is an informal market. That's what it looks like. On the right is an agro-dealer. So left, informal markets, right, formal market. Important about these informal markets, they're the source of the nutritional crops. And here I've put some legumes, groundnut, common bean, cowpea. It's the informal markets that offer the real diversity I mean, look at the range of crops. And surprisingly, it's the informal markets that most serve the IDP population, according to the data sets we have. So the informal markets are important for everyone, but particularly for the stressed, and we're trying to learn more. And here you see we have Kenya, DRC, Katanga, and South Sudan. So basically, I don't want to go over the data sets, but the overview is, in terms of smallholder farmers, own stocks and local markets are key. At this point, the formal sector, the seed companies, have a modest importance, and local markets often serve farmers even in high-stress conflict areas. And then I talk about diversity, nutrition, and particularly the poorest. Okay, two really quick cases. You've mentioned Rwanda. Rwanda, 1994, you know that the genocides of war hit in the middle of the growing season. 30 different agencies were distributing seed in a country the size of Switzerland. Where did farmers get their seed? And this is from beans. What you see, own stock was about half, and then markets, the first season, markets and relief seed were about equal, about a quarter. The second main season, own stock and local market was over 90% of the seed they sourced. Relief seed was only 6%, but the NGOs continued relief seed for another 8 seasons, because that is what the paradigm was, and that's what they knew how to do. Second case, Syria. You know, our teams were there right before the Russians bombed. Where did farmers get the seed they sowed? First column, I don't know if you can see that, it's mostly traders, very dynamic big traders, somewhat owned stocks, and in fact, the harvest was so good that seed use was up 13%. So it was a conflict, but seed use and harvests were abundant. NGOs working in southern Turkey said, oh my gosh, you know, this is a conflict thing. We have to do food baskets. We have to create nutritious baskets for people who are suffering. When indeed, what traders wanted, what farmers wanted, was to sell their own outputs. So they didn't want food to come in, they wanted their food to go out. Okay? So these are just two examples of counterproductive and even possibly destructive practice. Okay, I'm going to make 4 practical suggestions for action, and then I'm finished. Because this is a practical group also, which is very nice to know. I think the first thing is that in conflict areas, we have to leverage much more the existing informal markets. And I'm going to call them informal private sector markets, if that makes everyone happier. Traders, these big traders, go to high-risk areas routinely. And the ones that I work with and my teams work with, you know, routinely move 400 to 2,000 metric tons. So they work big scale. Now these traders, they're also conflict savvy. And I don't think it's enough to talk about conflict sensitivity. We have to talk about people who can navigate conflict, get things done, move in and out of areas fairly easily. So conflict savvy. Now, we can leverage the formal markets, the private sector, and I know that the USAID Administrator is very interested in this. If we do this, I think we have to select much more the companies with whom we work. And I say that we need to go to formal sector companies that have wide crop variety portfolios, that routinely serve an area, not just go in and out with the aid, but they're committed to staying there, who are conflict savvy, not a company that runs away the minute the fighting gets more intense. Point 3, and this is more academic, or advisory strategic. I think we should be developing sector-specific technical advice for conflict-type areas. And when I say sector-specific, I mean seeds or pests or storage. What can be done in what kind of conflict? What can you do with a seed security in a certain kind of conflict? What can you do with water? For seed, you obviously have to say that you have to be able to harvest what is sown. You have to consider the intensity of management needs. This kind of advice could save us so many mistaken practices in the field, and I don't think it's that hard to do. And then final point, no one's talked about refining the conflict typologies, but I expect that many in the room could do this. Currently, ICRC is very good for things like armed versus unarmed levels of violence, etc. But in terms of agriculture, what kinds of conflict scenarios allow for what types of interventions? Okay, so 4 practical suggestions: field action. We can do so much more on markets, stop the supply side stuff. And I would say both the informal markets and the formal markets. And then for those of you who work more on the advisory management side, sector-specific advice could have quick returns in a few seasons and better conflict typologies. That's it.
Absolutely excellent. I think what's interesting is when you take, it's hard to take the whole what needs to be done developmentally in these places, but when you take a specific issue like seed and you unpack it that way, I think it's insights not only for how we address the challenge of seeds in these contexts and tailor that to context, but I think it gives us insights to the broader approach we need to be taking around sector-specific guidance, around typologies, around not repeating the mistakes in the name of we got to do it quick and this is humanitarian. So that was a wonderful presentation. I'm inviting you all back to Washington as well, because we need to do this again. But before we move on to questions, we have another important presenter, and that's Mohammed Abdinoor, who I would describe as not just conflict sensitive, but conflict savvy.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this presentation today. Thanks, Greg, for the introductions. Please remind me if I'm past my time. I'm passionate about Somalia and agriculture, and I can speak for a while. So first, let me begin I work in Somalia. I'm based in Mogadishu, but our project, GALE, Growth, Enterprise, Employment, we work across Somalia. We work in different parts of the country, from the north to the south, in areas that are affected by conflict, and also in non-conflict zones. I think when you hear about Somalia, what comes to your mind? Conflict, war, humanitarian, crisis, Al-Shabaab, all the problems that exist. I'm not saying these problems don't exist, but there's another Somalia. There's a different Somalia. There's a different perspective of Somalia. As you all know, Somalia has been in conflict for the past 28 years. And so what's happening when it becomes protracted conflict? Communities develop coping strategies, they develop ideas, they develop innovations, they mitigate, they develop ways going around and finding solutions to their problems. And I'm going to speak a bit about the potential and also what we as a project do in Somalia to leverage Somalia's resources, Somalia's ability to move into the next generation. I think a couple of perspectives. Looking at Somalia in terms of the potential. In terms of agriculture, Somalia has the largest livestock population in Africa, I think, and also in the Horn of Africa. So last year, Somalia, in 2015, Somalia had one of the largest livestock exports, 4.6 million of animals were exported. Somalia also has the longest coastline in Africa, 3,333 kilometers of coastline, and fisheries and marine resources is a big potential. Largest export of bananas in the 1990s. Somalia was one of the biggest, and the banana sector in the 90s used to employ around 120,000 people across Somalia. Irrigation potential is huge, and I'll talk a bit about more agriculture and why agriculture is important. 8.9 million hectares of irrigation or irrigatable land along the two major rivers of Somalia. Sesame, Somalia is the seventh largest exporter of sesame. Sesame production is on the rise. Last year and this year, early sesame exports were around $300 million of export in Somalia. I don't want to go through each, but one thing I want to mention is the diaspora. Last week, this week, I spent some of my time in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and talking to the Somali community in the U.S. Somalia, and talking about social capital. Last year, the remittance of Somali services, financial sector, was around $1.4 billion. So even during the crisis, during the drought, during emergency, the diaspora community, not only in Europe or in the US, but across the Horn of Africa, have been able to remit large sums of revenue to the Somali community. So $1.4 billion of remittance is estimated. Youth population. Somalia has a really big young people. 70% of the population are classified as youth. So talking about conflict sensitivity programming, I think our project, since we work in conflict areas, the first thing we always do, and I like Susanna's points around how do you mitigate, how do you do activities in areas that are conflict? What mitigation measures do you have to put in place? And, so what we do, the first thing we've done at the beginning of the project is to do some political economic analysis, looking at the lenses around who are the key players, who are the key actors, who are the key stakeholders in different value chains that we do. Because often you're trying to help, but then there's always an elite capture. Maybe there's some groups that are unhappy about the work you do. And then for you to really buy in and leverage ownership and community ownership and even private sector ownership, is you need to understand who are the key players so that as a project, you can leverage, you can get a lot of information. So when we did a lot of analysis, political analysis, we had to have an honest conversation with the key actors. There are two value chains on frankincense and dried lemons that we really thought is a big potential, but we had to drop because the key players there were really, they're not willing to change. They were not willing to be more inclusive. They were not willing to partner with us in a more honest and strategic. So the issues around accountability, the issue around joint ownership is the kind of conversations that we always have to have with our partners at times. It's so difficult. I think the strength, we work a lot with the private sector. When I say private sector, it can be informal groups of cooperatives, it can be small, medium enterprises, it can be cooperatives, it can be women associations, it can be large commercial investors. I think leveraging the private sector has been our key strength. And I know Somalia, there's a lot of work on humanitarian assistance, but how do we do long-term interventions and leveraging both the diaspora and the Somali community? So as a result of our partnerships, working with different companies, sesame exporters, working with seed companies and fertilizer and agro dealers and agro input suppliers, working on the fisheries value chains and agro input suppliers and innovations and technology. These are some of the results of our project. And I think our goal of the project is also not just to create employment, but also build the capacity, introduce new technologies, introduce new ideas and innovations in agriculture and in fisheries and in livestock. So I don't want to go through these numbers, but I think some interesting ones. The one on diaspora, $10 million of diaspora investment in Somalia, while the total investment is around $26 million investment. We work with 5,800 micro enterprises. These can be small agro dealers, or it can be large companies. It can be, so it ranges from a revenue base of $500 up to $1,000 US. So in terms of leveraging, I think if you want to do in a conflict place, you have to work with different actors. And I think what I learned also is in Somalia, if there's a lot of focus on direct humanitarian delivery of assistance because there's a conflict. But the way we do is, again, to mitigate around the issue of conflict, is we always say we have to do a cost share. We have to co-invest. We have to co-own. If it's a community project, we want to do improving irrigation systems or working, the community or the groups or the association or whatever, they have to put resources on the table. That way you create ownership. Even if there's a Shabab or there's a conflict, whatever, they protect their assets because they have the ownership, they have put the stake on it. So that's how we're able to mitigate some of the challenges in terms of implementation. We insist on a significant amount of ownership and contribution. It doesn't have to be even money at times. It's around the time, the level of effort, labor, so there are different ways you quantify their contribution. Two examples I wanted to focus, one in sesame and seeds. You mentioned, my previous presenter mentioned about seeds as an important tool. So in Somalia, because of the conflict, because of the drought, we've been getting a lot of free seeds that do not meet the test, the germination, the purity. A lot of community members have been recycling their old seeds. So we worked with private companies to develop a seed outgrower, a seed multiplication system to improve the productivity. And one good example is a company called Filson. It's a diaspora-owned company, and they were the initial land grant university students that used to come to the U.S. They were here, they have the knowledge, the experience. Now they've gone back to Somalia and they're trying to rehabilitate or improve agriculture production. So working with companies and diaspora groups that are interested in long-term agriculture production and introducing new technology are the key examples of success, I think, instead of direct delivery or distribution of seeds. The other one is fisheries. Somalia has the longest coastline. We work with a private company called Harbour Tuna. They've invested over $3 million of their money, and we provided technical assistance, the market linkages, improving quality, HACCP standards, and making sure the products they produce, they meet the human requirements. So they employ around 300 people on their factory, another 700 fisher folks who go out to the sea to collect and catch fish. And mostly they're young people, so the goal is to create employment opportunities for youth. Last slide I want to talk about is the recommendations. Being here, I think it's important, and often in Somalia, the goal is humanitarian assistance, but it's how do you leverage humanitarian and long-term investments. And our examples, I think our project, GALE, is seen as a pilot project. Is how do you work in a conflict zone, but with a more resilience type of intervention. Although it wasn't designed as a resilience project, but in 2017, when the drought hit Somalia, we were better prepared than 2011. So there's a lot of capacity and government were prepared, organizations and NGOs were much more adaptive. And 2017, we saw a change in terms of response. Even this year, some pockets in Somalia are considered as a high risk. So what we do is like, how do you change gears from a humanitarian into long-term development? I think it's key. So these are just some recommendations I want to throw out. Commercialization of advanced agriculture technologies. I think the CJR centers are here, and mostly they're in Kenya, Ethiopia, in more kind of stable. I think the goal is how do we take these technologies and commercialize and make it more adaptive and relevant to conflict areas. I think women and youth is important. And the capacity building, somebody mentioned in the morning about capacity building. I think we need to build not only the private sector community, but also the public. In most of these conflicts, the government capacity coming back, so is long-term investments, I think, are critical. So thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think that was a wonderful set of insights into another frame about the possibility of Somalia. I actually had a great opportunity to work in Somalia for much of my career. I did my PhD research on Somalia's telecommunications industry, and I remember meeting with the head of Dahabshil, one of the biggest remittance companies, and he said, you guys are always asking about how much money comes in the form of safety nets. You're never talking about how much goes out on return on investment. So there is a huge inflow of capital, not just to allow people to manage through shock events, but as investment, and it's wonderful to see how Gale and RTI are leveraging that in the private sector. So the intent originally was going to be to have a set of pre-cooked questions that I would ask these folks, and we would talk back and forth. But with such rich presentations, with such incredible insights, I want to give the opportunity to you all to spend the last 15 minutes engaging with these folks and the questions you want answered. And I want to start with BIFAD and get some initial reflections and questions from you all. And then we'll move open to some from the audience here. And I do want to try and make a little bit of time for folks that are online, as Dr. Keenum said at the opening. So let's, BIFAD, please. And you can either direct your question or leave it open-ended for the panelists. Thank you.
Ask this question to anyone on the panel or all the panel. We're here today, as I mentioned in the onset, because of conversations that we had with Administrator Mark Green and his issues or concerns, I might say, about how USAID is able to address the needs in areas that are conflicted. And it's a great issue. When you hear that 70+ million people are displaced by some type of conflict, and many of these people are not only displaced within their country, but they're out of their country into some other foreign nation. And I guess my question is, understanding the conflict sensitivity and needing to be highly politically sensitive, but also for those populations that have had to flee their country and are in a refugee type setting, what type of initiatives would you suggest that we as a board could go back to the administrator as far as helping these populations from a resilience standpoint to have some sense of longevity, and they're in a foreign country. They're not subject to maybe property rights or a lot of other rights that they would have in their own home country, which has got a turmoil going on. So I'd be quite interested to hear comments from the panel.
Excellent. Maybe we take another question or two from BIFAD.
In a way, it's building on what Mark just asked. What would your ask be of the traditional research for development community? Are there outputs that you need that you're not getting now for the conflict-sensitive work that you're engaging in?
And my question maybe is directed specifically at Mahad. Have you seen anyone effectively interact with the diaspora population? The numbers you gave were very interesting, and I'm wondering if there are things in place for Somalia or other areas to leverage that resource. That was kind of a new issue for me to focus on.
Okay, so maybe we can start there, unless there's any other BIFAD members that would, yes, we have here.
Maybe start with expressing my compliments on the thoughts that have been expressed here. I was one of those that have not raised my hand about helping in conflict areas. I've been in the field of development for over 40 years, never stepped foot in the kind of areas you guys deal with. So I have tremendous respect for all that you do and the insights that you have developed. But as a person interested in development for a long time, I raise this question, and that is that it seems to me that every problem that arises in developing countries is demanding a generation of bright, insightful people like you who develop new sets of expertise to address problems of developing countries. My concern is this. As problems arise, trying to catch up with the problems and not in terms of being prospective enough to deal with the problems before they get to the stage where they need another layer, another process for the development. So I would like to ask the question in terms of your own experience from the things that you've been involved in. What does this mean to the development agencies? Because whether we like it or not, it's the same agencies, regardless of what country that you deal with, that are also responsible for conflict, are the ones that they are also supporting development. So what does this suggest in terms of the organization of the development agencies themselves? What does it suggest from the recipient country's point of view in terms of how they deal with development and all the other problems that arise? That's my question that I want to get your response to in terms of informing the overall development agenda and the institutional infrastructure that is in place, and the overextension of these agencies feel, and the left out notion that those in the developed world are, because they're left to believe that there are other agencies coming to save us because of all these problems. I was particularly struck by Mohammed's contribution in the partnership that he developed, or in the Somali activities have developed, in the conflict areas, the ones that we have not been very successful to develop working partnership between host countries and the development agencies. So I'm trying to look to you for response in terms of what your advice would be to the agencies that you serve, as well as to the countries that you serve, in terms of how investment in the future are perceived for both.
So not a small question. I am going to pass it, have you guys just respond to the questions you want. I know everybody will want to chime in there, but I want you guys to keep it very precise. Short, brief questions, key insights, key reflections, key reactions. Go for it.
Okay, so on the response on the IDPs, I think in Somalia, the IDP challenge, there is a push and pull factors. The biggest push, I think people displaced in the land is because of security and in Shabab in this area, especially in the agricultural land. And the pull factors is most of the IDPs in Somalia, especially around the main cities, receive a lot of humanitarian assistance. It's a safe haven and there's a lot of support. But what we're witnessing is as the government is pushing Shabab and freeing a lot of territory, is we're seeing a lot of quite large number of IDP. Normally when the IDPs, they go back to the agricultural land, they don't all take their family back. So often, maybe the male or the young people will go to the farms, they do agriculture, they do farming. One area, again, as I mentioned, the banana sector. In the 90s, Somalia used to have a big banana plantation. The land is there. We've been working with some of the private companies to expand the banana cultivation, the agriculture production. So we're seeing an increase, especially on young people who are coming back to the farms and working with companies like Filson. We do a packaged distribution of subsidized seeds, fertilizer, and working with NGOs who are doing humanitarian assistance to develop a joint activity where we encourage IDPs to go back in some areas that are more secure and safe to begin farming. So we develop packages for agriculture interventions. I think that's where the humanitarian space and development work together. WFP in Somalia is piloting Purchase for Progress, where they buy maize from small-scale farmers for distribution for humanitarian assistance in areas of need.
Great, let's come down the line.
Is this on? Oh, good. So I'm going to answer the one about the research sector, and I think the research sector has huge roles, but not in delivering supplies. I think it's a very different set of roles. For instance, I'm going to give 5 examples actually. GIS, using GIS to say which markets can serve which areas. So areas where markets aren't working, what markets could you stimulate to serve that area? It's virtually unknown. Second, the demand side analysis in conflict. We always do the supply side analysis. What can we bring in? What kinds of techniques can we use at scale to understand demand of populations at risk? Third, I mentioned as one of the action points, sector-specific advice. I mean, what a hole and how important. And then the fourth, I just want to highlight, and then we can talk after about the other 10. But the fourth is evaluation of the interventions that went in, but at a higher level. For instance, the way that most farmers in the world, poor farmers, get new varieties is through aid. They don't get new varieties through going and buying them. They get it through aid. We don't know if they replant those drought-tolerant varieties, if they cycle them. So we have this huge investment giving free varieties, and we have no idea what happens the next season. You have such a huge role.
Just maybe to respond to the question on displaced populations, I think that's something that we've been trying to do systematically, is ask 2 questions during both the design and the implementation. One is, what happens if tomorrow the population that we're working with have to be displaced? What do we do, and how do we build the resilience around that? And 2, what if tomorrow there's an influx of refugees or IDPs in the areas where we're actually intervening? And I think there are some pieces of evidence here and there. For example, we've learned that in Syria, people with more movable assets were more resilient, just because, if tomorrow they have to be displaced, they can take their small livestock with them, for example, and not lose everything. But I think that's probably also a response to the second question about the research, is that we just have anecdotal evidence around that. We don't actually really know how to build the resilience of the displaced population. So that would be definitely a potential piece of research.
Great. This is not working. Okay, I'll just speak up. So
Well, we're going on
it does. Great. Okay, great. So I think in relation to the displaced or refugee populations, I don't have an answer about exactly what to do, but I think it's important to realize that often there are more people displaced or dispersed than in camps, right? So in camps, they're there, you can deal with them, you can actually help to at least deal with short-term food security issues, but it's the people who are dispersed in the population, who are living with friends, or living with family members, that actually present a kind of more intractable problem. And so to really think about how you expand the kind of entire value chain, or kind of expand the availability of food to address the increased challenges being put on particular households. I'm going to be very quick. So in terms of what R&D needs to do, it needs to focus on the how, not just the what. So if there are systematic interventions that are not evaluated, figure out whether they are having an impact or not, but also begin to look at mechanism-based evaluation and process-based evaluation, where you try to capture how to actually do work in a way that builds the things that we're talking about, that builds ownership, that builds capacity. Also invest in researchers in these countries and help to give them the capacity to do that, so that you don't always have to fly in some person from another country to do that. That's a huge unexplored area, and it's extremely important. Finally, this is absolutely relevant to development. The big problem with development is the modalities of aid are constricted to primarily bilateral cooperation that privileges the preferences and the politics of the government and ignores the population. Most development aid, the largest proportion of ODA, is currently given to fragile and conflict-affected countries. This is absolutely an issue for the development community that it really needs to grapple with.
Fantastic, and thank you for keeping it brief. As I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative to try and at least comment on this huge question that was asked by a BIFAD member. I think this is the central dilemma. I think we as development practitioners have failed in some senses by thinking that we are going to go along solving problems, and the next problem comes and we solve that one, and then we'll get together a new a group of people to solve the next problem. And that's, I think, a fundamentally problematic approach to development. And our Administrator Mark Green, and this could be dismissed as just wordplay, but his vision for a journey to self-reliance, if taken seriously, is actually incredibly profound and addresses just what you're talking about. It's about building the commitment and capacity of countries, and not just government, but private sector, communities, et cetera, to address their own development challenges. And if we are held to a standard where our success isn't measured by whether or not development outcomes were achieved, but we're actually held to account of whether or not country capacity and commitment were achieved, that has the potential to fundamentally change the approach we take to development. So it is not the answer on the face of it, but it is a framework that actually, if we take seriously, I think begins to get at that huge, huge question that you asked. And with that, I want to thank this incredible panel. I wish I had a hand in shaping it. I did not. I just showed up, and I'm absolutely blown away. So congratulations to my colleague Jesse and BIFAD. And Dr. Keenum, please join us at the podium.
I tell you what, Mr. Collins, to the panel, that was outstanding. That was exactly what we were looking for. I think that's exactly what the administrator was hoping for when he charged the BIFAD board to convene this meeting. I sincerely thank you for your input and your insights. With that, we're going to turn to this, what we call public comment period. For any of those who are here would like to make a public comment on what you've heard or what you'd like to share with the BIFAD board, we'd welcome your comments. And also, Susan or Devin, any of those who have been watching over the internet and would like to submit their comments for us to entertain. So with that, I'll open the floor.
First, I really appreciate the panels all morning long on the topic of conflict and development. I'm Ed Price from Texas A&M on the USAID lab for conflict and development. One of the things that is troubling or concerning to me is how far upstream can we go with designing technologies for conflict regimes. Conflict sensitivity seems to take it only so far, but I think we have ample evidence that development can be designed to favorably affect conflict. And even further upstream from that, even to design crops and technologies and animal technologies that can affect conflict. Just to give a quick example, we're working presently with a conceptual notion at CIAT that we can develop a cassava plant that is particularly adapted to conflict regimes. And I believe that we can go much further than that with other crops. For example, also CIAT has genetic material for lima beans that that could be strong also in cyanogens, that can be removed by a farmer but hard to steal and utilize. So that would be one of my interests, is learning how far upstream we can go with designing systems for conflict-affected areas.
We'd like to have another comment or question? Right here. Dr. Crable.
David Crable, Professor Emeritus, Ohio State University. I'd like to raise an issue that I raised earlier, but I'd like to raise it in the context of the public comment now, and that has to do with where does resiliency reside in the social, political, and economic context of a country. If we think of a country before conflict, and then we think of a conflict coming in, which maybe is a little bit simplistic. There may have been conflict there even before it emerged as an open or, say, violent conflict. But how do we expect that what was there before would then come into the conflict in order to create the capability for resilience? Once conflict occurs, how do we expect that resilience could be established so that in the presence of the conflict and beyond the conflict, there could be political, social, and economic stability? So I get back to the question of capacity building, and in particular, the role of institutions and organizations, that is institutional and organizational capacity building, which I believe is where resilience of households and communities actually resides. That's the, I don't know what you call it, that's the framework in which resilience can be carried from one state of stability or instability into another state. How do we do that?
So I'd like to try another one. And this is interagency cooperation. During Iraq engagement, the Minister of Agriculture of Iraq, the first one, confided to many of her colleagues that the biggest problem she faced was the lack of cooperation between U.S. agencies working in country. In fact, that it was actual outright hostility and attempts by different agencies to pull her in different directions, and said, this is very hard for me to mediate for you in your approach toward development in the country. And just to go back a little bit, I know that there are efforts and discussions of interagency, but to my knowledge, the last time that there was a real concerted effort to have a unified command in development was actually in Vietnam. And there's actually a somewhat ignored story of a very successful effort of U.S. foreign assistance in Vietnam that was successful in bringing back enormous changes in the agricultural sector of Vietnam during the war, despite the other tragedy that has dominated our thinking.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. I had a chance to speak earlier. I'm Colin Hendricks from the University of Denver. It's too bad Mohammed just left because I wanted to pick up on something that he flagged. We don't tend to think about the maritime space as being a space that is conflict affected because of the types of conflict modalities that we're talking about typically don't have a strong kind of naval component. Somalia is a little bit of an outlier in this respect because of the links between, sort of the collapse of fisheries-related livelihoods and participation in piracy, et cetera. But that's just something that wasn't discussed at any great length in our discussions today, but I know that aquaculture and fisheries development are a significant component of USAID's programming in this space. And so I just wanted to flag that as something that maybe could benefit from more discussion in some other kind of fora.
Very good. Please.
Yeah, I can come over here as a participant here. I think Dr. Gabisa's point that development and STARS, development experts don't think about conflict is very telling and true. And I wanted to raise the issue that conflict is no longer a niche product, a niche situation. And how do we change the development and even humanitarian discourse to say, what you're saying is fascinating, sir, that we be proactive about not just responding in conflict, but figuring out how to design and manage it. So I'm supporting you. So I just wanted to make a statement for all of us that conflict is not a niche situation anymore. And that has lots of implications, even for development professionals.
Dr. Heenan, I was thinking about your question that was posed by the administrator. What about the IDPs? What about the displaced people? And it made me think of an experience that Emmy Simmons and I had in Nigeria around Abuja last year when we traveled there. We visited 3 different camps, communities, where displaced people from the Northeast had settled around Abuja. And they were remarkably different. The first camp was, I think, what I had, as my sort of go-to vision of what happens in a camp. It was sad, roofs were leaking, people looked forlorn. There was a welcoming committee with a list, of needs. The second community sort of didn't really have time for us, because they were so busy. You could barely distinguish the community of displaced people from the wider neighborhood of Abuja. And they were busy. They had organized their own school. They had tried to figure out, well, how are we going to integrate? They sent people off to different areas to do farming. So, that message was they had already integrated. They were part of the urbanization that we talked about and bringing their skills to bear in new economic considerations, and they did not have time to sit around and compile a list of needs for us. Although, they received a lot of assistance. We saw water tanks, et cetera, et cetera. The third community had solar lights, had streets that were marked out, and was just, it was amazing, the cohesion of this community. Streets laid out, people had organized their own markets, and it just, I think, spoke to a lot of the things that we talked about here today. It really comes down to local context, and it all comes down to strengthening local leaders, and also to recognizing that, the solution many times to displacement or IDPs is not really going to be send them back to where they came from, or even, give them a seed package or whatever, because especially in Northeast Nigeria, Soji knows, many of those folks have been displaced, for 4 or 5 years and, may never go home. Right. So how do you really focus on, well, what are the skills that they're going to need wherever they end up, this capacity building that David has talked about, and think about it in those terms rather than focusing so much on got to get them back to their farms, et cetera.
Well, Howard, that's excellent. And,
I wanted to comment on the importance of early warning systems. When you talk to leaders in conflict areas and you ask them, didn't you see this coming? Most of them would say, we didn't see this coming. And most of them also agree that once the crisis has set in, it becomes far more expensive to deal with than if you had a vision of this emerging in the first place and you started to do something to prevent the crisis. In fact, in Nigeria, I did an analysis to convince my bosses that we needed to be doing something about preventing future crises, to come up with an estimate of what it costs to have averted Boko Haram in the first place by looking at development costs in different parts of the world. And it becomes very, very clear that it's far cheaper to actually avoid it in the first place than have to spend the billions of dollars in military, humanitarian assistance, and so on and so forth. Point I'm trying to make is that we need to figure out better ways to predict conflict in ways that would help decision makers actually avert conflict. And I think that's one of the most important areas. The president of Nigeria once said to me, if I knew this was going to be this way with respect to Boko Haram, we would have acted a lot sooner and figured out ways to avert the problem. Most policymakers don't even realize that there are things that lead to conflict. You know, it's usually after the conflict is occurred, then everybody starts to scramble.
Devin, do we have any comments from those watching online?
We don't at this moment, but if anyone in our live stream has questions, you can email them to me at dferguson, Ferguson, @aplu.org. We would love to hear from you. You've been silent so far.
I just want to mention in a public comment, Central America and the domestic policies, the intersectionality of agriculture in Central America. I do my research in Honduras with farmers, and so just wanted to throw that out there, the development, agricultural development in Central America and people fleeing violence, and that cross with domestic policy.
Right.
Okay, we do have an online comment. This is from Philip Steffen on AgriLinks, and he asks, or he says, one of USAID's several objectives is to further U.S. national foreign policy interests. In the case of Yemen, USAID is aligned through the USG with the Republic of Yemen government. Right away, this puts USAID on one side of the conflict. Since aid is not neutral, all aid sends a signal. Per the first panelist about knowing about this, panelists, so I assume that means Susanna, about knowing about the staff in the field, how can USAID partner staff be viewed as sincere, effective, and inclusive in their work so that all benefit? That's a big question.
Oh. Well,
Please.
Please, Susanna.
I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I think that the USAID has to make a decision about how it wants to actually deal with its alignment with the government. And if you can somehow detach the programmatic piece and create better localized relationships, build trust, actually do cost sharing, do some of these more localized accountability mechanisms, then maybe you're going to actually help to correct for some of the bias. But if the bias comes back in top down and undermines what is happening at the local level, programmatic level, then it will completely undermine it, right? So if you don't do anything at the political strategic level and you keep that constant, then you have room. If the political strategic comes in and undermines what's happening at the community level, then what's the point?
My third and last comment. I feel that it's not useful to continue to distinguish development post-conflict from development during conflict. That separation is somewhat artificial. In fact, history tells us that those who have been in conflict often return to conflict, and that there's a conflict trap there, as Collinson calls it. So I'd simply suggest that the best way to recover from conflict is to be engaged in the conflict period. In fact, Andrew Natsios and I talk about this every now and then, and he feels that the basis for recovery from conflict needs to be established while the conflict is going on. And those who are engaged in conflict, as all of us know, there are entrepreneurs there who are trying to make a living, they're trying to feed their families, and they deserve as much as those in post-conflict to have our partnership in other than humanitarian relief, in actual development effort.
Thank you, Ed. Well, I'm going to kind of wrap this up. I am going to comment and again thank Dr. Julie Howard for her comments about the 3 scenarios of refugees camps and you know, in talking with leadership within USAID and the administrator and talking about displaced people who've had to flee their own country and are in camps, and some of which are there for years. Some are born in the camps. They grow up in the camps. That's all their life they know. And are we to think about how we can maybe, from a capacity development standpoint, capacity building, identify individuals in these refugee scenarios for education and training and specific skills, hopefully in agriculture. And Ed, you and I had a chance to visit before we convened this session and talking about things that we can do from prevention of conflicts, potential conflicts, but also a cure for conflicts. And that's what we talked about earlier, and that's agricultural-led growth. Using agricultural and development, both on the front end, if you've got strong, robust agriculture in developing countries, you have less tendencies for conflict. And then to get out of conflicted situations, if you can somehow introduce types of programming in areas of these that are going through conflicts to try to get them to adjust out of that, to reduce the need for that type of conflict as an intervention. So these are some things that I'm coming away with from this wonderful session, both panels this morning. So as we wrap this up, I would like to invite back to the podium Dr. Julie Howard to do one final wrap-up for us for this session. So Dr. Howard.
Thank you, Dr. Keenum, and thanks for that great round of questions and responses in the last panel as well. So my takeaways are mainly from the first panel, but a couple of things also on the second panel. And before I start, I want to say that we're beginning and ending with Somalia. I don't know if Greg remembers, I also began my Africa career in Somalia, in fact, working with some of the people that Mohammed mentioned, the folks who are working on Filson. So I was there pre-war. I tasted those incredible Somali bananas and camel's milk, and I think, you know, this vision of what's possible with human capital of Somalia and with, you know, sort of entrepreneurial acumen and with the support of the diaspora is just something amazing. So I want to congratulate Mohammed and Gil and that project for really showing what is possible when the rest of us, many of us, walk around with visions of destruction and conflict. That's not the whole story. So what we came away with in our first panel, we've said time and again, global hunger is disturbingly on the increase today after many years of decline, especially in these areas where we're seeing increasing prevalence of conflict. Feed the Future has compiled an impressive track record since it started in 2010, but the times have changed. In the first phase, Feed the Future very purposefully selected countries that were stable, had good governance, committed to increasing their own investments in agriculture, and as we've been talking about all morning, as the second phase is underway, Feed the Future is already changing, already adapting to work with, to help to ameliorate this new reality of rising hunger in more fragile places. So the panel that I moderated provided an overview of the available evidence to help guide Feed the Future at this inflection point. The panel agreed that the focus on agriculture, food systems, and ag-led livelihoods is just essential for survival and recovery in conflict-affected areas, and we can't lose sight of that. But a new response paradigm is required. Humanitarian and development interventions with this also political economy overlay really need to be integrated and implemented together. I think we heard time and again, throughout the two panels and this discussion, that strengthening the capacity of countries, individuals and institutions at community levels, at national levels, to prevent and manage conflict determines their future development potential. And I think we could add, is going to determine whether or not they survive or not. That is the challenge in front of us. Capacity. How many times did we hear that today? Greater focus on food and agricultural development may be key to preventing social unrest and violent conflict, given the potential for creating income and employment opportunities for those most vulnerable to extremism, especially youth. In our panel, we talked about preventing extremism from taking hold in fragile states and how an inclusive approach is needed that focuses on building national and local partnerships with leaders in government, civil society, and the private sector, with women and with youth. Reducing vulnerability requires not only after-the-fact interventions, but precautionary investments in building this kind of social cohesion, governance, and building trust between people and their governments. We talked quite a bit about, Leanne especially, more focus is needed on equipping youth with the knowledge and skills to enable a secure and prosperous future and be a force for positive change. So I think what was most interesting, maybe my biggest takeaway from our panel, was that grappling with the shared critical challenges that we've been discussing all day can provide a potential avenue to rebuild trust between people and governments. For example, Leanne spoke about corruption, and so demonstrating in agriculture space, how can you be more transparent? How can you create a cheat-free zone, is a powerful demonstration, help rebuild this trust. Including youth in movements to change a community's trajectory towards climate change offers a positive alternative and delivers some of the benefits that have been delivered by extremist groups, the sense of belonging, a shared cause. So sort of taking a page out of the playbook of the extremist groups and putting it towards the good. There's a lot of opportunities to do that in agriculture space, and my sense is that we're not really focusing hard enough on those yet. Colin talked a lot about the care that must be taken to understand and anticipate the political dimensions of agricultural development policies and programs. Many of these unanticipated knock-on effects that can magnify in the future. So critical really to deal clearly with the tensions between food security as a component of human security, humanitarian assistance, and thinking and knowing that food security is also a really critical component of power and national security. And so I think we don't know enough. We don't know much yet, really, if we're honest, about how to effectively integrate humanitarian, ag development, and national security strategies. So we need much more work in that area. And effective policy and program interventions are going to require a much stronger knowledge base that examines the cross-linkages and effects across the three dimensions. And then just informally on this last panel, I think, what I'm struck by is, we heard markets, we heard capacity, we heard finance, we heard agricultural research. And I'm left with feeling like we're just, we really need to push the learning from Feed the Future, the success of Feed the Future in market space, in finance space, in research space, and direct it more purposefully towards these conflict and fragile affected areas. I just feel like we're not there yet. And Mohammed's discussion of the role of the diaspora is another area that I think is barely touched. We talk about the remittance flows, but it's much more than that. They can be a really vital part of rebuilding this social compact. So I'll end there. But thanks to everybody. I think this has just been a wonderful morning.
Greg, I'm going to call on you to make some wrap-up comments.
Great. I'll keep this very brief because our panel was so recent and I hope fresh in your minds. But I think just reflecting a little bit on what Julie said, we've heard you can't do that before. We heard you can't do development in northern Kenya because that's where recurrent crises happen. And you got to wait until the recurrent crises stop for the conditions to be in place to begin to do development in northern Kenya. 5 years later, after we ignored that and actually committed ourselves to making long-term development investments in northern Kenya, including an inclusive ag-led growth as a cornerstone of our resilience efforts there, in partnership with the government of Kenya, with a bunch of donors, we've seen poverty dramatically decline between 2013 and 2018. We have recent data. Even more powerful for me, we also looked at agency, the ability of people to shape their own future. And when we looked at that in baseline in 2013, about 32% of people felt they had a hand in shaping their own future, which is pretty devastating if you think about it, but not all that surprising given they've been on the receiving end of food assistance for the last 20 years, grown up on food assistance. At Endline in 2018, 72% of people in northern Kenya felt they had a hand in shaping their own future. So that shift in agencies and people's perception of their ability to shape their own future actually fundamentally speaks to the dilemma we face here. And they said we couldn't do it in relation to climate shocks in the Horn of Africa. We are in motion and in progress. It is a work in progress, but we are making clear progress there. And now we again need to adapt to an even more complex, wicked problem set, this confluence of not only climate, but conflict, and conflict increasingly a driver. And what we heard throughout the first panel in terms of describing the nature of the problem, and what I was so heartened to hear from the second panel is not we could think about this development, we can do development in these places, we must do. We can't, as Louise reminded us, continue to approach seed systems as an insight to a broader phenomena the way we've been doing it, because we're fundamentally trapping ourselves in a perpetual humanitarian state. So it's not that we can do development or we should do, we must be doing development and thinking about these problems developmentally. And there is a sense of urgency here. I think you're right, Julie, that this problem has in some places like Niger and Burkina Faso come to us. We designed a portfolio to deal with recurrent climate events, but now it's been further compounded by extremist threats spilling over the border from Mali. So we have to again adapt, and we can't take the project cycle, the research cycle to begin to adapt. We need all those things kicking in motion and moving fast, but we've got to begin to adapt now. And I think I was just completely heartened by the conversation. It is a conversation we've started in a number of places, but the level of detail in terms of insights on causes and links and downstream effects, the level of detail in terms of what we need to be thinking about in concrete operational terms in terms of working in these areas is incredibly useful. So just to conclude, somewhat as Julie did, we need to take the lessons of successful initiatives like Feed the Future and adapt them to these complex risk environments. So that means learn everything we did, and we achieved incredible results through Feed the Future, but they must be adapted if they're going to make an impact in these places. And I think we began to have that conversation today. So thank you, everybody. I really was really blown away by the quality of the panels. And thank you, BIFAD, again.
Oh, my goodness. Greg, well said. And I think you all agree. We've had two excellent panels this morning and on a very important topic. And as we said earlier, on a very timely topic for our world that we live in. I also want to recognize someone with us today, and that's Dr. Beth Dunford, who's sitting here on the front row. She is the assistant to USAID Administrator Mark Green for the Bureau of Food Security, as well as serving as Deputy Coordinator for the Development for Feed the Future. Dr. Dunford, thank you for your leadership. And Dr. Rob Bertram, who has joined us, who's the Chief Scientist for USAID. Dr. Bertram, we thank you for your leadership and your service. Thank you, sir. And I also want to thank and recognize those who helped put this session together. Dr. Jessica Anderson with USAID, Karen Duca, Dr. Clara Cohen, who's sitting right here, who is the liaison with the BIFAD board and the administrator, Susan Johnson, Devin Ferguson, and Tag Dement, all with APLU. I want to thank you for your leadership and your service to this session. So with that, I'm going to call this session adjourned. Thank you all for being here. Great job.